Next up, we have Dr. Lipika Goyal, and she is a gastrointestinal medical oncologist and a phase 1 doctor at the Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center. Her research focuses on the development of effective therapies for cholangiocarcinoma and hepatocellular carcinoma through translational and clinical research efforts. Dr. Goyal.
Thank you, Dr. Knox and Dr. Roberts and the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation for inviting me to speak. It's always an honor to be here. So if you look back a decade, this is what the landscape of cholangio used to look like in terms of the number of people that were studying this disease. It was like 6 little birds on a wire. There were not enough trials for patients with cholangiocarcinoma because they were bucketed in with patients with pancreas cancer and liver cancer, and they didn't really have a home. And when the WHO did their cancer statistics, they bucketed in patients with cholangiocarcinoma with patients with liver cancer. Here in 2019, this is what the landscape looks like. Now there are so many more birds flocking to the wire. There are more pharma companies, more scientists, more physicians, huge amounts of patient advocacy, and there's a lot more interest in this disease. And if the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation meeting attendance has anything to give us an inclination as to the interest, when I first came here in 2014, there were less than 50 people, and from what I hear, there are 480 people here today. And so there's so much more interest now than there was a decade ago. And similarly, if clinicaltrials.gov is any indication, we had less than 50 trials about a decade ago and more than 400 trials now. But if you look at the state-of-the-art standards for advanced biliary tract cancer, in the past decade, there's only been one standard. And when Dr. Knox emailed me almost a year ago and said, can you talk about the state-of-the-art standards, I was thinking to myself, what does the word standard mean? And I was recalling a young woman who spoke up at the podium, at the microphone last year, who said, what if you have an FGFR2 fusion, but you don't live near one of the large cancer centers? And that always stuck with me because it reminded me how important it is that we actually need to enroll people on clinical trials and get more drugs approved so there are more standards, and so people all over the country and all over the world have access to these drugs. And so while we look at this, I was thinking to myself, instead of talking about the state-of-the-art standards, I would do more of a State of the Union address because I felt appropriate for this week. So more, where are we now in terms of what could be the new standards that are coming? So I thought, I could talk about some of the negative data that have come out, but as Anthony said, Jennifer did a beautiful talk last year, and not too much new positive data has come out that's practice changing for advanced biliary cancer, but we've certainly laid bricks. So this timeline doesn't really show all the bricks that we've laid, and that's what I want to talk about. What are the trials and what are the promising new targets? And so also for this disease, we always like help from our friends, and we know that pembrolizumab was approved in MSI-high cholangio, so that's about 2% of patients, and larotrectinib was approved in patients who have NTRK fusion. That's probably a little bit less than 1% of patients with cholangiocarcinoma, but certainly those are available for our patients. So I'll talk about two things. One, what are the phase 3 frontline trial that are poised to potentially change practice? And two, what is the promising chemotherapy regimens and what are the targeted therapies that are available right now for refractory advanced biliary tract cancer that also show promise in potentially giving us new standards. So as you noticed, I talked only about chemotherapy and targeted therapy on my last trial. Those are 2 things I'm going to focus on because one of my good friends, Dr. Katie Kelly from UCSF, is speaking in about 45 minutes, and she's going to talk about immunotherapy. So instead of doing a superficial job and being redundant, I thought I would leave that to her. So whenever you're thinking about what could change the standard, you got to know what the benchmark is. So cisplatin plus gemcitabine was more prolonged survival more than gemcitabine in this phase 3 trial that Dr. Valle presented at ASCO in 2009. The median overall survival was 11.7 months in that trial, and that included patients with intrahepatic, extrahepatic cholangio, and gallbladder, and periampullary. So this is the standard that we've been trying to beat since 2009. And so I went onto clinicaltrials.gov and I pulled out all the phase 3 trials in the Frontline that are going on for cholangiocarcinoma. And I put them in 3 buckets: chemotherapy trials, targeted therapy trials, and local regional therapy trials. So in terms of the chemotherapy trials, one is the gemcitabine cisplatin plus nab-paclitaxel versus gemcitabine and cisplatin alone. Another is FOLFIRINOX versus GemCis because of the similarities biologically and prognostically between pancreas cancer and cholangiocarcinoma. And then in Korea, there's a trial of GemOx versus Zelox to see if a 5-FU-based regimen can beat out a gemcitabine-based regimen. For targeted therapies, we have the ramucirumab or muritinib trial when added to gemcitabine and cisplatin. And then we have 2 FGFR inhibitor trials that are going up against gemcitabine and cisplatin in patients that have FGFR2 fusions or rearrangements. And then we also have several local regional therapy trials. One involves CERT, and the other 2 involve hepatic arterial infusion. There are several other phase 3 trials that are in development, but these are the ones that are right now on clinicaltrials.gov. And I will highlight one trial from each of these different categories. So I'll first highlight the trial of gemcitabine cisplatin nab-paclitaxel. This was the phase 2 trial in patients with advanced biliary tract cancer. In the evaluable patients, there was a 34% response rate. Now this is a phase 2, but if you look at the response rate in the phase 3 trial, that was 26%. This certainly looked promising, and you can see the PFS was 11.8 months, and with GemCis, again, a phase 3 trial, but that was a little over 8 months. And then the median OS was 19.2 months. So this is the kind of phase 2 data that we hope for, that we can actually move to a phase 3 trial. And in the final analysis, there were 12 patients who were initially deemed unresectable, who then eventually went to surgery. And 2 of those patients had a complete pathological response, which means that when the pathologist looked under the microscope, he did not or she did not see any cancer cells. So it seems like an active regimen, and this effort is being led by Dr. Rachna Shroff, and it is the phase 3 randomized trial of these 3 drugs versus 2 drugs. They figured out the dosing in the phase 2 trial, and so they have a tolerable dose. It's going to be a randomized 2-to-1 trial. It's going to go through the cooperative groups. And this is the first randomized trial in biliary tract cancer in the United States. So they're also going for ambitious hazard ratio of 0.61, and they're looking for an improvement from 11.7 months to 19.3 months. The second one I'll highlight is a targeted therapy trial. This is a phase 3 trial of either ramucirumab or muritinib being added to gemcitabine and cisplatin, and it's a placebo-controlled trial. This completed accrual in July 2017, so we're hoping to hear the results soon. So ramucirumab is a humanized monoclonal antibody against VEGFR2, and muritinib is a MET inhibitor. It's a small molecule tyrosine kinase inhibitor that has many different targets, including AXL, NTRK123, ROS1, FLT3. And so this has a very nice design because it basically enrolls the fewest number of patients necessary to answer the question for both of these drugs, whether either of them will be superior to gemcitabine and cisplatin alone. And then lastly, we're always trying to spare our patients chemotherapy because we know chemotherapy has a lot of toxicity. And we're also trying to see if we can treat the tumor that's in the liver itself very aggressively, because if our patients get into trouble, it's often from the involvement of the liver disease. And so radioembolization, both SIRS-FIRS and TheraSpheres, have been an emerging therapy for cholangiocarcinoma, a lot of the efforts led by the team at Northwestern. And this is a trial that's led by Dr. Brewy and Dr. Wassan, and it's a trial of SIRS-FIRS plus cisgem compared to cisgem alone. As of May last year, they had enrolled 37 patients, and they had not seen any additional toxicity when they looked with the DSMB. And overall, they're going to stratify by how much extrahepatic disease patients have. People are allowed a limited amount of extrahepatic disease, whether or not patients have cirrhosis. whether or not they're going to treat the whole liver versus more directed Y90, looking at the albumin and then also the ECOG performance status. So this is the first randomized trial that I'm aware of with SIRS spheres in cholangiocarcinoma, so we look forward to these results. So on the whole, I think of GemCis having a benevolent hegemony in our disease. It's been very helpful for our patients for many years, and it certainly shrinks tumors and prolongs survival. But it's certainly time for us to be able to give our patients longer survival and better outcomes. And so we have 9 shots on goal. I'm hoping in the next 1 to 2 years in this conference, we're going to be talking about a new standard for cholangiocarcinoma. So next, I'll move on to second-line regimens. So we've had a lot of phase 2 trials of chemotherapies, targeted therapies, also immunotherapies. And overall, the progression-free survival is about 3 months, no matter what kind of therapy we give patients, the median progression-free survival. And that equates to about 1 scan. So not sure what we're doing with these second-line therapies. But one trial that's going to hopefully read out this year in ASCO, if we're lucky, is the ABC-06 trial. It completed accrual in January 2018. And this is a trial of patients who received gemcitabine and cisplatin going on to FOLFOX versus best supportive care. So now I'll just move on to targeted therapy. And the way I'll talk about it is thinking about a few key targets that have shown promise, and I'll use that as a framework for how we think about studying targeted therapy in an uncommon tumor. So the genetic landscape of biliary tract cancer, we know that mutations matter, as the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation has just started a campaign. Intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, gallbladder cancer, and extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma anatomically are distinct, but also molecularly distinct, as Anthony also mentioned. And so the FGFR fusions, the IDH1 mutations have been very promising in intrahepatic cholangio, as have the BRAF mutations across these cancers. So what are the potential benefits of targeted therapy? Ideally, the way it's supposed to work is you're going to offer the right drug to the right patient for the right disease at the right time with the right dosage. And what's the potential benefit of doing targeted therapy? It improves outcomes for patients. You're giving drugs that work better, so you get more tumor shrinkage and they hopefully live longer. You minimize adverse reactions. These drugs are supposed to be like homing pigeons. They're supposed to go to the cancer cells, and they're supposed to ideally not have as much collateral damage. Now, of course, some of these targets exist in other organs in our body, so people do have collateral damage, but oftentimes targeted therapies are better tolerated than chemotherapy. Reduce costs of clinical trials. If you have a drug that works, you need less patients to prove that it works. So pharma companies are happy, the US government is happy, clinical trials get done faster, drugs get approved faster. And then accelerated FDA approval. The FDA has been wonderful about thinking creatively about how to get drugs approved. And so now you don't have to have a randomized phase 3 trial to get accelerated approval for every single drug. And so we've seen a lot of examples in the past 5 years of the FDA allowing single-arm phase 1s or single-arm phase 2s to get accelerated approval. So this is the way I think about our approaches to evaluating targeted therapy in cholangio. So I think of target-specific cholangio trials. So this is for drugs that are targeting IDH1 mutations and FGFR2 fusions. So this works because there's a reasonably high frequency of these targets, about 15 to 20% for IDH1 and maybe 10 to 15% for FGFR2. Then we also have target-specific all-comer basket trials. So BRAF mutations are maybe 5% of cholangio. So it's hard to get a company to do a rare target in an uncommon tumor. And so the way these work are for all-comer different kinds of cancers, but then there's a cohort for patients with biliary cancer. And the third is this biliary basket trial with target-specific arms, and we'll talk about some of those. So I'll start with these. So the phase 1 trial of AG120, this was presented in 2017. There were 73 patients enrolled, 68 patients were evaluable. We see the response rate was 5%, and the stable disease rate was 56%. This was helpful in being able to go on and plan the phase 3, because as you can see, the PFS in this trial was 3.8 months, and the 6-month progression-free survival was close to 40%. So when they planned the phase 3, they used PFS as a primary endpoint, and there was a healthy debate at this conference 2 years ago about whether or not it was ethical to have a placebo-controlled trial, and with a lot of conversation and advocacy from everybody, and a company that's very committed to patients, they developed a crossover design where after 6 weeks, if a patient was progressing, they could be unblinded, and if they were on placebo, they could cross over. This trial has almost completed accrual, which is in record time, in 2 years, for a biomarker-selected trial in an uncommon tumor. And so we look forward to these results, hopefully later this year, to see if this will be a new standard for our patients with IDH mutant cholangio. And then for FGFR-altered cholangio, this is a trial with BGJ398, led by several people here at this conference. And this basically showed that patients who had FGFR2 fusions had a response rate of 19%, and about 83% of patients benefited from this. And so this was much higher than what we normally see with second-line chemotherapy, where the response rates are more like 5%, sometimes up to 10%. And so since the BGJ trial, there have been many other companies that have also looked into that have also been evaluating their FGFR inhibitor in patients with FGFR alterations. And now there are several pivotal phase 2 trials that are ongoing, and as we saw, some phase 3 trials that are also ongoing. Target-specific all-comer trials for biliary. We have the ROAR trial that was just presented 2 weeks ago at GI ASCO. And so BRAF mutations are seen in a variety of different cancers, and in this trial, 35 patients with biliary tract cancer were enrolled. Dabrafenib and trametinib were given, and what we saw was a response rate of around 42%. Again, unprecedented for second-line therapy, so this was remarkable. The PFS was 9.2 months, and the median OS was 11.7 months. So this is certainly a promising avenue as well. And finally, biliary basket trials, and this comes from what we're seeing in the MATCH and the Moscato trial. The MATCH data has not been released for biliary, but the Moscato trial it has. This is the European version of the MATCH trial. And basically this was a trial of almost 1,200 patients with hard-to-treat cancers, and 43 of those patients had biliary tract cancer. And of those 43 patients, 19 patients ended up going on to get a MATCH therapy. And that's 44% compared to the overall population of the trial, where it was only 19%. So in biliary tract cancers, we certainly see targets, and we certainly get people onto trials. And then for the overall response rate, it was 33% compared to the overall trial, where it was only 11%. So again, a disease where targets matter and mutations matter. And we're also seeing that the time on therapy is more than 10 months for several patients, so they're not just short duration of response. So there are basically 2 efforts that are going to be a biliary-specific type of MATCH trial. One is the BATCH trial, and that's going to go on here in the US. That's really been made possible by the friendships that have developed in this community, largely due to this conference in many ways, and the great advocacy that the foundation has done and many of the patients have done to have all these companies work together. And basically, patients, while they're on gemcitabine and cisplatin, they'll go ahead and get molecular profiling, and then at progression, they'll go on to one of a series of different molecular targets. I just mentioned this briefly because Dr. Laura Goff from Vanderbilt is going to also talk about this later in much more detail. But most companies are not going to go for a big trial in a 5% population of an uncommon tumor. So this is a great way to have multiple arms. And then also in Europe, there's going to be the ABC-10 trial with 800 patients and using foundation testing. So the state-of-the-art standards for advanced biliary tract cancer, we have a lot of shots on goal. We have 9 different phase 3 trials that are already going on right now. We have potentially second-line FOLFOX, FGFR inhibitors, IDH1 inhibitors, BRAF/MEK inhibitors. There's a whole panoply of other targets I didn't mention, like HER2 inhibitors, PARP inhibitors, PI3 kinase inhibitors. There are many different things in the pipeline. So I would say that the most important thing is we try to enroll as many patients on clinical trials as we can, and patients as much as possible to get treated on trials, because that is how we develop new standards for more patients to have access. So what is going to be the next standard? I don't know, but I know the state of this union is strong. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Goyal. So